Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fighting on Film. This week we have something a little bit different for you. We are going to be talking about war in non-war movies. So this is something we've been talking about for over a year. It's got to be. It's one of the ideas we batted about early on for like a discussion show.
It's been on the FOF HQ, like we've got a list of things and ideas for shows.
Yeah.
I think one of the early ones, yeah.
Yeah, so I thought the other day, well, I'll just throw it up on Twitter and see if this chimes with anyone else and see if they can think of any films that fit in within this sort of concept of there's war in a film that isn't overtly a war film. Yes. So I took that, the famous Dunkirk sequence from Atonement, 2007's Atonement, and put a little post out on Twitter at Fighting on Film. And the response was insane. We got over 100 replies, and according to Twitter analytics, that tweet was seen over 40,000 times.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Wow.
So out of those 100 replies, what we've done is we've compiled as many as we could, pulling them off Twitter, and we've combined them. We've come up with a couple of our own, and then what we're going to do is we're going to run through all of them, talk about them in brief, and see what we make of the concept of war in non-war movies.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of these scenes, obviously, like the ones that we might talk about in more depth at the end, I think it's Forrest Gump's interpretation of Vietnam War. I think it's Atonement's Dunkirk sequence, and it's Cold Mountain's Battle of the Crater, which is a siege of Petersburg in the American Civil War. And those for us were the three standouts. And I know that Cold Mountain was mentioned a lot, and Gump was mentioned a few times, and so was Atonement. I think got a lot of mentions. But there are some honourable mentions before we get to analysing those scenes in a little bit more depth. So let's start off with, we had Sean O'Keefe was saying the Vietnam scene in Birdie is ace, plus it's a great movie. And
it is an interesting movie. It's kind of like PTSD and the psychiatric impact of war. Yeah,
it is. It's and there's a short sequence where one of the characters is sitting next to a Huey before a napalm strike comes in, and there's lots of birds flying, and that's quite a.
It's really short.
Scene.
It's
5
less
minutes?
than a minute more, I think.
Is it a minute? Oh, blimey!
It's really short. It's just it creates that Vietnam mind space, I think.
Yeah, it does. It does. You get the smash Huey, the man with his flak jacket on, being wounded. But in cinema history, that movie is quite interesting because it's one of the movies that gets Matthew Modine his role in Full Metal Jacket, and we obviously know how popular that goes on to be. But if you've read Full Metal Jacket Diary, which is Modine's the experience Modine had on working on that movie, he mentions Birdie quite a lot. I think it's one of the movies that I think when he's talking about doing the auditioning, it is one of the films that gets him the role eventually in that. And if you haven't read that book, it's fantastic. I'd recommend it. But yeah, it's a nice little sequence.
Dr. Grant Harwood suggested, I watched spy drama 0 Dark 30 the other night. I didn't like it. It misrepresents the importance of torture in getting to find bin Laden. The 2019 film, The Report, shows the reality. The raid on the compound at the end is very good, however. And yeah, I watched The Report with Adam Driver not long ago, and it doesn't really fit into this conversation because there isn't any real depiction of the war itself.
Right.
It more recreates some of the scenes of torture from the enhanced interrogation program that they were running. And the film is based on a real report that was done by Congress, Senate, and it showed that the torture and interrogation methods that are an element of 0 Dark 30, and in reality, they didn't really get any results. But I liked 0 Dark 30. I thought it was interesting as an early effort to tell that story. And the raid sequence has genuine tension to it and is quite interesting.
Yeah, I remember that one being quite a big movie when it came out, actually.
It was, yeah.
So now we've got Noka or Nurka Han Erk. Sorry if we butchered your name there. But he says The Snows of Kilimanjaro, starring Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner, a pretty good and realistic battle scene from the Spanish Civil War. And that one's really interesting because it just comes out of nowhere. He sort of Gregory Peck walks out of a room and then you're in Madrid in like 1936 or 1935. It's such a bizarre little way it cuts, but it's quite a good battle sequence actually. So there's a lot of scale there.
I hadn't seen the film, so I sought it out and I watched the elements of that half an hour where it revolves around the Spanish Civil War is really interesting. It's a love story, and he's looking for Ava Gardner, who's working as an ambulance driver, and
in the most immersion-breaking Dodge ambulance ever. I can't help it. I'm just like, that's not correct.
I know. I don't think Franco's forces had quite as many Vickers guns as those lads did either.
Vickers guns, yeah.
But
weird
no, it's a really
things.
Yeah, those. But it's a really interesting depiction of the war because there aren't that many depictions of the Spanish Civil War, and that's probably like an early-ish one.
But it is an interesting one because I think you've got men in black caps, which would denote they're anarchists, and I thought that was quite interesting. Even if the movie doesn't mean to it's representing a battalion like that, and then also there's a representation of the American Lincoln Brigade. I assume there'd have to be, and he's talking about, I was over was it Washington or Detroit or somewhere, and he's like, now I'm over here. And he's talking about like his process of one of Peck's
it's a long
comrades.
Story and so.
It's a long story. It's quite interesting.
And Peck talks about how he found himself in a war he didn't want to be in, and all this sort of thing. Really interesting the way people fall into conflict. And well, the film I was trying to think of that predates this one is For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's what I was trying to think of.
Yeah.
But there aren't that many. And as you said, Land of Freedom in 95 is the other big Western one. I can't think of any.
It's the only major Western one. There's a few Spanish movies that do deal with it. There's I can't remember the movie's name now, but there's one about female fighters, which is
there's one that gives quite a good overview as well. Like I think it's a mini series. Simon Whippet and incidentally, History Age podcast both suggested, quite interestingly, the USS Indianapolis monologue from Jaws.
Now you'll have to fill them in on this one, Matt, because I have a phobia of sharks, so I couldn't even bring myself to seek out.
Simon said no action but impact. I'm not spoiling Jaws for you, Rob. But no, I think it's interesting that monologue is so strong that it comes across and fits into war in a non-war movie.
So now we have Ian Houston. He says the opening Civil War battle in Dances with Wolves. Yeah,
with Kevin Costner.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's trying to commit suicide, if I remember rightly. It's been quite a while since I saw Dances with Wolves, and he rides his horse towards Confederate lines.
Yeah, and you were saying everyone follows him.
Yeah, it becomes a bit inspirational. It's an interesting film, Dances with Wolves. And I think it's is it Costner's first directorial debut or film? But it's an interesting one because the way that they have that set up, it's the classic lads lining a picket fence. Yeah, there's a Civil War cannon, and it's just a mirror image linear battle scene kind of thing, and then he rides through it. It's
a lot of these Civil War sequences we watched for this episode. They blur into one after a while.
That's true, actually. Yeah, with Coal Mountain and
Free State Jones.
Yeah.
Then we have Miguel Rabidis, who said, "Legend of the Fall not getting enough love here." And there's a great sequence in that where Brad Pitt scalps a German machine gun team, and it's not something I ever thought I'd ever see on camera.
No, it's quite a scene. So that that's the most famous element of the film, isn't it? He's I suppose he's a Canadian Tommy, and he sees his friend who's caught in some wire get shot by an MG08.
Absolutely obliterates him,
yeah. And he happens to be behind this machine gun position in a wood, charges it and shoots the gunners, and then he goes out and
in no man's land after.
Another machine gun team.
Yeah, it was interesting to see Brad Pitt in like World War One uniform, because I just hadn't seen him in
it's probably the only time you'll ever see it. Yeah.
He comes up again, Brad Pitt, I think, doesn't he, in this episode?
He does. Jonas Grumby suggested Benjamin Button.
There we go.
I recall an Allied convoy scene headed to Murmansk where it was attacked. And I don't think I've ever seen Benjamin Button.
It passed me by when it came out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I watched that scene and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. He's on like a trawler, it seems to be like a small trawler, and they attack the U-boat. It's quite a spectacular sequence, done. Actually. Yeah,
I thought it was more interesting just because it represents Murmansk convoys.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. Because when have we had another on-screen depiction of the Arctic convoys? Yeah, exactly. Of the Arctic convoys.
Yeah, because that's another thing as well with these sequences we're talking about. I know we're not going into massive depth just yet, but it is important where some of these scenes, they might be the only depiction they have in cinema to date at the time of recording. So it is important. So obviously that these things get representation. I know, like last week, I went off on one about revolutionary development cadre teams when we talked about Hamburger Hill, but because it's such a small thing, but it's important historically. It is nice to, when you find these clips from movies that have the representation, if even something very, very small or something very, very big and important like the Atlantic convoys, it is nice that they have their day in the spotlight. It's good.
And Benjamin Button's a film that you wouldn't expect to see it in.
No, exactly, no, not at all.
Speaking of films that show conflicts that you don't often see depicted, Ian McClellan suggested there's some good pike and shot type battle sequences in Captain Alatriste, the Spanish Musketeer. I described the movie as a romantic adventure story, and I think Ian's right there. It's based on some novels, but it's set during the 80 Years' War. For Dutch independence and Spanish control of the Netherlands, etc. Not something I know a great deal about, that's for sure.
No, me neither.
Probably not many films are set during that period.
No, not at all.
Rob hadn't seen that sequence, so I showed him yesterday, didn't I? And it really is like an interesting form of warfare that is never really depicted.
No, you get
push of pike and such.
Yeah, pushing pike. You get men getting right into it with the hand-to-hand combat. With this is it. Would be muskets or it's flintlocks, isn't it? That period.
Matchlocks, yeah.
Matchlocks, sorry, yeah. And the people firing that, and there's just a lot of good representation again. And it, me and Matt were saying again, like there's not any. You'd expect something like that maybe from an English Civil War movie, but there just don't seem to be any real attempts yet at that war. That's another question for another day.
I think the closest we've got is Cromwell with Richard Harris.
Yeah, and there was a film with Reece Shearsmith called A Field in England, but I don't even think that shows.
That's a very small scale, sort of thing. But yes, it is. Yeah, English Civil War set definitely. But yeah, I think Captain Alatriste is a really interesting film because it depicts the tertiary at the Battle of Rocroi that refused to surrender. It's a really interesting climax to an adventure film.
Yeah, it's a very, very good visceral sequence there. And then moving on to At Service Charged, he said, Liam Neeson in Michael Collins' 1996 has some good depictions of the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War. And that movie opens with the Easter uprising at the post office. And it's only maybe like a minute or two of screen time, but it was very well done and holds up very well. And you just don't see, we have hardly any on-screen depictions of the uprising. I think there aren't many.
But yeah, I mean, there's only a handful of films in total that deal with that period of Irish history, you know, when Shakes the Barley and those kind of movies.
There's a lot of like social films about the Troubles and about that period, but there aren't any that really directly address the fighting as much. So when you
it's
see
true,
them, it is a different.
I suppose Michael Collins is a pretty straight biopic.
Yeah.
In terms of it's Liam Neeson as Michael Collins, and it starts off at Easter Rising and then shows the aftermath of that and how they move towards the attempt political negotiations, etc.
Yeah.
Conflict breaks out again, and there's throughout the film there's little sequences of action, but that opening is really powerful because it recreates the inside of the devastated post office, and there's lads firing out the windows. I think Liam Neeson's got a broom-handled Mauser.
Yeah, he does. It's as if you're coming into the siege at the end of the siege.
Yes.
So it's an interesting way of doing it. You don't get the full context of the why. It just shows you what's happening, which is an interesting way of doing it. And it's a great little sequence. It's something that you wish you would have seen that they'd have just done more of, because it was very tight, very well shot. A lot going on. It
captured what you would imagine
the essence of
it to have
what
been
you
like.
imagine. Yeah, exactly. It did that fantastically. And then moving on to Tom Seston, who I think had the funniest comment of the thread when he said the war scenes in the romantic drama Pearl Harbor were really good. We thought that was fantastic. I mean, if you've listened to our live we did with Woody of World War II TV over Christmas last year about Pearl Harbor on film, it's unfortunate because Pearl Harbor itself, not a great movie, but there are just snippets of action
Elements
in that
of
film
it work,
that just work. I think we came to the conclusion that if you cut about a 5-minute, 6-minute slice of action out of the harbour scenes at the end, then it's worth it. But the ensuing couple of hours just isn't worth anything really.
No. And that's an interesting one in that it highlights that blur of how you interpret war in non-war movies. Like, so many films are set during the war, and then you can sort of differentiate that as films against the backdrop of war, where the war is going on, but it doesn't actually impact on the characters. They aren't driving the story of the conflict.
That's it.
The war is impacting on them, that sort of thing.
Because we got into it when we're not recording. We got into it about Empire of the Sun.
Yeah.
When Matt was like, "That's a good war film. That's a good film, isn't it?" I said, "Well, it's not a war film, is it? It's a prisoner of war movie. It's in its own subgenre."
Well, I said it was it was war in a non-war movie.
Yes,
I just
Matt's right, but I just see it as it's almost like a coming of age film as well. Like there's a lot in that film actually. We should cover it though. It's a great one.
I was talking to someone on Twitter. I forget who it was now. I don't seem to have it in the notes. But someone suggested Paths of Glory, the Kubrick movie.
Yes.
And that is another one where genres warp and it becomes a courtroom drama around men accused of cowardice. But there's so many films like that. There's like Sergeant Rutledge, Rules of Engagement,
Hearts War.
I mean, we could do a month on military courtroom movies. And they all invariably have some fighting in them.
Yeah, they do.
Some more than
others.
They
have sequences at least.
Yeah. I think most people would say that Paths of Glory is a war movie.
I would go there. I'd go there as well.
Just because that sequence in the opening is so effective. But then you could say that about Cold Mountain, perhaps.
Yeah, I guess you could. I mean, the majority.
I mean,
I'm
not gonna put Cold Mountain and Paths of Glory.
No, of course not.
Tier,
but there's no. But in the sense of that, there's no direct. The main characters aren't necessarily soldiers all the way through, or they're not in combat situations. But it is set within a war. It's very. This is the thing with this episode. It's very hard to pin it sometimes.
It's quite fluid in the definition, I think.
So moving on to the next thing, and that actually brings it in to our next suggestion, is from Jenny Grant. So it's in Polish. You might remember her from our 303 Squadron episode about the Polish fighter pilots. She says, Lord of the Rings trilogy, unless that actually is a war film. What do you think, Matt? Fantasy movie.
Yeah, But then it has all of the World War One influence and love from Tolkien and stuff, doesn't it? And there's a lot of playing into it.
There is a battle going on, the battle
There
between
is. It's
man and
a
the
conflict.
orcs. Yeah, it's a conflict. It's interesting, isn't it? It's like, how far do you go with the concept?
I mean, is Star Wars a war movie?
Well, it's set during the Galactic War, isn't it? Between the Empire and the Rebellion.
I would argue that Star Wars is a series of Star Wars movies about an insurgency.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. And Lucas based them on like the sort of adventure war serials that you watched in the 60s and on repeats.
Yeah, he pulled a lot from all sorts of different things. Yeah,
well, obviously the trench run is directly influenced by 636 Squadron. So
yes,
there is a lot of parallels there. But no, I think maybe Lord of the Rings, you can interpret a lot of that being influenced heavily by.
But is it war in a non-war movie then?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the battle for Helm's Deep.
I think actually, when you think about it, perhaps it is a trilogy. If you take the first three movies, if we're solely talking about the films, that is not the books, obviously. Then the first film isn't really a war movie.
No, it's more of a road film, isn't it?
Yeah. The second and third have more elements of conflict in them.
Yeah, they do. Actually, you're right there. Actually. Yes, because it's just not a genre of movie or a type of film we've talked about before. So it is interesting.
No, it isn't. No,
highlight them. And then we had Dr. Grant Harwood again. He said Stanley Kubrick.
He poured on quite a few good suggestions and came up with the hashtag WINWM. I know. I was going to do it phonetically, but then I thought, no, that's going to sound weird. War in non-war movies. Thank you for that, Grant.
Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon from 1975 comes to mind. Some great ASEAN.
Enchant, yeah.
I can't speak.
It's that 1800s linear warfare.
Yes. It's very good.
It's set during the 7 Years' War, isn't it?
Yes, another war that gets barely any love.
Indeed, definitely. And this is probably one of the most prominent depictions of the 7 Years' War on screen, I think.
British Grenadiers. It's such a great little sequence.
It's a lovely little sequence. What I like about that sequence is the narrator describes it as a battle that you'll not find in the pages of history.
It's good, isn't it?
It's a let off from, this isn't historically bang on, but it's a representation of the conflict that Barry's finding himself in. So it's really interesting, I think.
Then he said Big Fish in 2003, Tim Burton's mythical depiction of an airborne drop behind enemy lines. That sequence is bizarre, to say the least.
Yeah, during the Korean War.
During the Korean War, which is
involves a North Korean ventriloquist and a conjoined pair of lady twins.
Opera singer.
Doing a musical number as Ewan McGregor floats in.
It has like a in the dark cartoon style fist fight with two North Korean guards. It's very
definitely
bizarre.
An odd one.
It's maybe like a 2-minute long sequence. It's interesting.
He suggested another one that might be a bit of a debate. He says the almost criminally underrated The Four Feathers remake, the effort to relieve General Gordon, and the breaking of the square is a fantastic bit. The breaking of the square part of that film is good.
Admit that is fantastic. That bit's very, very good.
Visually, I don't know whether historically it's the most accurate depiction of.
No, I have friends who are extras in that one actually.
Oh, really? That's
some
really
of
cool.
my reenactment buddies were extras in it. There you can pick some of them out during the scenes where they're getting on the ship to leave and things, which is quite nice. Yeah,
again, that's a period that just isn't depicted very often.
Hardly ever. You get the long Lee Enfield action, or the Lee Metfords in it. I can't remember what they're using at the time.
I think they are. I think they're Lee Metfords in the original Four Feathers, and I think they're Martinis in this one. That you could do we could do a whole month on the Four Feathers adaptations.
Again, yeah. Four Feathers February next year on Final Film.
Four Feathers February. Oh my god. But again, you could debate that isn't a war movie; it's more of an adventure film. But still, it's interesting. I think it fits within the war in a non-war movie.
Yeah, it does. Definitely does. because there's definitely military elements and war elements in that film. It's I always imagined that in my head before I went and rewatched the sequence again. I thought it was a strict war film, but it's not really. Then we've got Andrew Corbett, who says Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Yes. Yeah, definitely war in... and that movie is set during the Second World War. So, and there's a big... at the end, you haven't seen it, ladies and gentlemen, there's a fantastic sequence at the end where you've got... I can never remember the actress's blooming name now.
Is it Angela Lansbury?
Angela Lansbury fighting and like an animated suit of armor, and then the Jerry's coming off of a U-boat, and they start shooting all these like moving like sets of armor and stuff, and it's just bizarre, but it's that Disney charm about it.
It's great. They empty out like an old military museum, and all the arms and armor come out, and there's lots of comedic bits where like a full plate armor knight gets riddled by MG42.
Yes,
he's given a full 250 round burst there, Rob.
massive one there. Yeah,
and he empties out his boot, and all the rounds. Yeah,
it's great.
It's really cool. I love that as a kid. I really did.
It's a great film. And there's also a thing. Me and my wife mention it a lot actually. There's a sequence in the movie where there's this sort of like a dance sequence in a market in London.
Yeah.
And there's some really good representation of all the elements of the British Empire who were fighting.
Yeah, it's like Pimlico or somewhere like that, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's sailors, there's Afro-Caribbean, I think there's Polish soldiers like represented. There's just a lot of really nice Allied representation in this little part of the movie. I think it's really... That's another thing to commend that movie on, because I wasn't expecting it in let alone a Disney film, but let alone a kids movie. So it was nice to have the inclusion, and you get the Home Guard represented, which is
you do. Although it's a bit of a pastiche, but
bit of a pastiche, but they're in there, I guess. So it's something.
On another comedic level, we've got from Benji Lee. He suggested Biggles the movie.
Do you want to be a hero? Hero. Love that film.
Who can argue with a Yes soundtrack?
It is great. I love that movie. Like, I can't wait
so
to cover
weird.
it.
I know, when we eventually do it, it's going to be a weird episode. But yes,
Biggles.
It's up there with Gun Bus, which is another weird. Why are they making these odd 80s movies where like there's time travel elements and weird steampunk zeppelins and stuff? But it's
the section set on the Western Front though is quite well done, I think, actually.
Yeah, I mean,
much better than it needs to be.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It could have been a lot worse.
And it could have been. And the alley tally on that episode would be fantastic.
Yeah, all those MP18s and stuff.
Sterlings.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Bizarre.
It's really good. I always imagined the thing that they should have done with Biggles, and I think Rick Mal wasn't old enough yet to do it, but if it had been Rick Mal as Biggles, then I think that movie would have been perhaps a lot more, a lot better remembered.
Maybe, it probably would have taken on a bit more of a cult. Although it is
a cult film anyway.
Yeah.
But I think he would have, because obviously he's flash art, isn't he, as well? So that might have really worked if they'd have got in. Serve said, "Don't all shout at once." Cold Mountain 2003, but we'll get onto that one later.
We'll come back to that one.
Yeah, that was suggested by you, actually.
Yeah, it was. It was Lester J. Bandito and Dan Fettel also suggested Cold Mountain, and I think there were a couple of others as well. If we don't mention your suggestion, we do apologise. But there were, as I said, 100 replies, and Twitter is notoriously awful to pull things from.
I know.
The number of times my browser decided, "Oh no, I'll just refresh."
It's a nightmare, isn't it?
Please no, I'm at the bottom. I'm near the bottom of the list of Twitter. Don't do this to me.
Hello, Robbie here. Did you know you can support the podcast on Patreon? Join the supporting cast today and gain access to exclusive perks, such as discount codes, our monthly Patreon film votes, and the chance to get exclusive merchandise before anyone else. Search Fighting on Film on Patreon or find the link on our website. Thank you. Now back to the show.
Kerry Thomas suggested, does The English Patient count?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Directed by the same director as Cold Mountain, actually. Nice little tidbit.
Yeah, you mentioned that before we started recording. I didn't know that at all. That's really interesting.
Jen Forster, who said the short war scenes in The Quiet American provide a brilliant insight into the changing war in Indochina/Vietnam and the US involvement.
Absolutely agree, Jem.
100%.
That was one of the ones that came to my mind as well when I started thinking about this. Brendan Fraser, Michael Caine, really, really like that adaptation of the book, actually. I think it really works. But yeah, it's an interesting film. There's some really tense sequences where they're on patrol with Michael Caine's a journalist and he's embedded with some French paratroops.
Yeah, it's great. A great little section. Then there's hardly any. This is the thing that me and Matt were saying as well. In terms of the Vietnam War, US involvement, obviously you've got a plethora of movies, but in terms of French involvement, Indochina,
the Indochina War is just
it's nothing. It's Bindi and Philly 92, and that movie is
fantastic,
an incredible movie. It's can't wait to cover it, but there's hardly anything. So for the fact this movie does its own, does its thing, and shows you them there, it's good.
Next up, we had a suggestion from Russell Burgess, and he suggested the battle at the start of Gladiator is pretty good,
pretty decent.
Yeah, if you keep an eye out for the extra wearing jeans, it gives you an extra bit of fun. But it's another one of those sequences which establish the time period the film is going to be in, and does some context laying, doesn't it?
Yes, I agree. From what I remember of it, it's very the scale is fantastic.
I haven't seen Gladiator in it must be like 15 years.
Yeah, I think I watched it when I was at uni last. But I remember the opening section being very grand, and it does set you up, doesn't it? They don't make movies like that anymore, really, do they? Then we have Peter Spez Baby on Twitter. He said Wonder Woman. I know you've got a lot to say about that section, Matt.
I hadn't seen it, and then Rob made me watch it, and I hate it so much. There's so much in that I hate. Like, she's literally playing the part of a tank.
It's bizarre, isn't it?
It's so bad. It's just cringe. It looks awful. I hated it.
Me and Matt will admit to all the listeners that we're sort of over superhero movies now. We think they're a bit oversaturated. They're a bit overdone. We think it's weird. And I think it's odd that DC decide to put their movies directly in the war, whereas Marvel sort of side-skirted it in Civil War. Captain America, sorry. They sort of side-skirted it a little bit, where they alluded to him being part of the conflict, but they didn't actually show it. And I just thought it was a bit weird that this one really did set it in, because then it opened up a wider discussion with me and Matt about not only representation, but is this fair historically? Because all those men that are dying and fighting, are they the real people who are in that section of trench? Is this actually meant to have happened? And of course, in the canon of Wonder Woman, yes. But in the wider scale of talking about representations of history, is that fair?
Yeah, there's a whole debate you could have.
Yeah.
I mean, we recently did the Kingsman, which is another World War I set movie, and to their credit, they don't have like a ridiculous, stupid sequence where Ralph Fiennes like just charges through a load of Germans and hits them with a shield and stuff.
It would, but then it didn't.
Yeah,
there is a sequence in that film with. I mean, that could have gone on this list actually. The trench raid scene in Kingsman is like that, but it's set within two factions fighting the war, and it's got Kingsman editing elements, but it's not got. You're not putting in a superhero doing superhero things in a war, which
I mean, again, when we aren't strictly a war movie podcast, we cover fighting and conflict and basically anything that kind of fits into the loose definition that we have. But if we find it interesting, it's often worth a chat. But I just could not. I just sat there just cringing with Wonder Woman.
It's just there's lots of weird editing choices in that section.
Yeah, it seems so dated, although it's only like 3-4 years old.
Yeah, you're right. That's another thing to mention. Then we have Philip Amaral, who says the Battle of I can never say this one. Hammond-Aptra. Is that right?
Hammond-Aptra, yeah.
Hammond-Aptra, where Rick O'Connell, played by our favourite mummy killer Brendan Fraser, is a captain of the legendary French Foreign Legion in The Mummy, 1999.
Adored that movie as a kid. Adored it. No one has looked cooler on screen dual wielding pistols than Brendan Fraser does in that film.
He does look great in it, doesn't he? And he's got when he's firing his label, he's got his rounds in his mouth. Oh,
Yeah.
it's a great little sequence.
It's so good.
Not, yeah. I think
clearly it's like it's coming off the back of films like Beauquest and March or Die.
Yeah.
Those classic Legionnaire films where they've taken a little bit of inspiration from that, and you get a little set piece desert battle with. They aren't the riff in this film, but they're riffing off the riff, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's such a great little opening sequence.
It really is. It's just a cool little action sequence. Really well done. Really tight. You got
not a real conflict either.
Not a real conflict, no.
Doesn't really make it a war movie, so it definitely fits within that war conflict in a non-war movie.
It's just a great little sequence, and Brendan Fraser gets to do his action sort of hero thing, and it's just a lovely little sequence. But I'd never really seen that movie till I was in my 20s, so it's not, for me, it's not one of those childhood movies. It's a great little sequence though.
David Moore suggests Dr. Zhivago and the Duelists.
Right, I hadn't seen either.
That's terrible, but
I know, right?
Dr. Zhivago is an amazing piece of filmmaking, I think. But I will admit it is a good maybe 5-10 years since I've actually sat down and watched the whole thing.
Yes.
And it's set during the Russian Revolution and Civil War, and I would agree that it's not really a war movie. It's more of an epic tale of one man's life, and there's a love element in there, and there's a little bit of historical context and background. It's like a historical piece. It's very similar to Lawrence of Arabia, Lean's earlier movie.
Right.
But the Duelists, now that's definitely a interesting movie to talk about. So you watched the duels, right? I sent you the video.
I saw some of the duels. Yeah, it's interesting. It looks good. Like it's Harvey Keitel and Keith Carradine.
Yeah.
In the Napoleonic era, but it's not necessarily like a Napoleonic War movie. And they get ticked off by one another, and they just have these series of duels.
They do. There's honor needs to be satisfied. And then they just spend the next 10 years, every time they encounter one another in one of Napoleon's sprawling campaigns across Europe, they go, duel. And they both look at each other and go, duel. So they end up having a duel.
Do they?
No, they don't. They don't really do that, but it's they kind of do.
It sounds like some sort of like weird Western.
But yeah, they end up fighting on horseback with pistols, with sabers, with short swords.
It's very impressive sequences.
And it's a beautifully shot film. There's a really visceral bit that depicts the retreat from Moscow. Instead of dueling, because they're both frozen, Rob, and they're both cavalrymen. Their horses are dead. They're basically crawling across the Russian steppe during deep winter. And then Cossacks appear. And they set aside their conflict, personal vendetta for a moment and fight off these Cossacks. And it's a really interesting study of honor and the ridiculousness of that satisfaction of honor and pride and stuff. It's an interesting movie, definitely. And David is actually the person who suggested Paths of Glory that I couldn't remember who'd mentioned it.
Oh, there you go then.
As well. So a couple of really good and interesting suggestions from David there. So I suppose before we get into the most common three though that were mentioned and some of our favorites as well, I'll just run through a couple of the other suggestions that people made that we haven't had a chance to speak about in more depth.
Sure.
Kevin Hookfield suggested the backdrop to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which absolutely that bridge scene.
That's good.
Where there's a battle and you get quite a bit of scale that you don't anticipate is an impactful one. Peter, aka Skeeter, aka Spares Baby, that's quite the handle.
Quite a tag.
Suggests Legends of the Fall again, and also Round by Kurosama and Wonder Woman. So that's quite a variation there.
Yeah.
Jack Prius suggests Free State of Jones, which is another one of those Civil War movies, which has a bit of a battle sequence in there, one or two, I think.
Yep. Not bad.
Ken Corrigan suggested The Water Diviner in Australia, which definitely has war in it. Again, it's that backdrop of war, but it's war in a non-war movie, I would definitely say. A few other people suggesting A Very Long Engagement. And then Colin Taylor suggests the French film of Wall Hat. And then we had a couple of interesting ones. We had the depiction of the Battle of Jenkins Ferry at the beginning of Lincoln, which is literally 20, 30 seconds, but very
30,
brutal.
40 seconds, but very impactful. Yeah.
Sean Chambers suggested that one. Another Civil War one, Counterpoint 01 suggested Gone with the Wind, which is, I can definitely go with that. Dave Harris rounded out with the bombing scene of Dresden in Slaughterhouse 5, the adaptation. Some fantastic suggestions.
I think you're right. Yeah, some really good ones.
I think we've covered most of them there, but as I said, if we missed yours, do apologise.
Yeah, that's the thing again. Like every time we put out a request from you guys for suggestions for something or another, we're always astounded with the response we get, and it's amazing. So, I mean, there's a couple of honourable mentions for us. I know that both of us we picked out the Devil's Own shootout right at the start of the movie, just because it's a bit of an anomaly within that genre.
Interesting 90s movie about the IRA, and that's a Brad Pitt movie with Harrison Ford, and there's a quite a big shootout at the beginning of that film where some IRA members shoot it out with what looks like a whole company of British troops, and it starts off with some guys I assume are like Special Branch or SAS, I think, following them, and they lead them into a bit of an ambush.
Yeah, and it's an interesting little shootout because you don't get many set within that period, really. You don't think of that, and the fact it is set in 92, it's not set in the 70s or the 60s.
Exactly. So and it was made in 97, which is Good Friday Agreement right there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting depiction. But it's just an interesting one because there's Saracens, there's SA-80s, there's MAC-10, there's a lot of weaponry on display.
SA-80s in that kind of context.
One of the few, yeah. Just an interesting little sequence of a movie there. That was one that I wanted to mention. What about you, Matt?
I mean, we've covered a lot of the ones I came up with. The Quiet American was one I thought of, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly sequences was another, because you get there's a prison yard sequence, and then there's lots of, it's against the backdrop of the Civil War, so you get lots of destroyed little towns, and there's railheads and deserters being shot, and it's a very interesting backdrop. If in terms of those spaghetti westerns, it's a much more populated world than you get with his other earlier films. Sergio Leone's earlier spaghetti westerns, like A Few Dollars More, etc.
There was one for me that it's not a massive segment. I think there's maybe like 10 seconds, 20 seconds of screen time, but it always, as something where I felt like a war scene didn't really work, was in the Winnie the Pooh reboot from like 2016, 2017.
Right, the Christopher Robin movie.
Yeah, that's it, Christopher Robin with Ewan McGregor. There's a very short segment where he's in, I assume it's meant to be like France in like 1940 or 44, and he's like sheltering behind some cover with a rifle. It just seems a bit out of place. Like it's a very weird. I know that I watched like a press junket thing for it, and they were saying, it's about how Christopher Robin's changed by the what his experiences are in the war and stuff.
Yeah.
But yet in the movie, there's maybe like 10, 30 seconds of him out there. And for me, it just felt like an odd thing to include. That's all.
They must have just felt like they needed something to signpost that he was, he was involved in the war and that kind of thing, I guess. But no, I haven't seen that one.
No, it's an odd one, isn't it? It's just, for me, it was an odd sequence. So moving on to talking about the big three. Now, these were ones that were mentioned quite a lot or got a lot of reaction when we mentioned them. So we thought we'd talk about them in a little more depth.
Do you want to start with Forrest Gump, because it's your favourite out of the list, Rob?
1994's Forrest Gump, Tom Hanks, directed by Robert Zemeckis. For me, it's like a really formative movie. Watched it when I was quite young. It's always stuck with me. I think the story is really like about human endurance and the human spirit. I think it's a really great film on its own. But
great performance from Tom as well.
Yeah, exactly. 94 seems to be like a really strong movie year for movies. But yeah, there's a great Vietnam War sequence in it. So it starts in 1967, where Forrest is going to the Mekong Delta with Bubba in the 9th Infantry Division. The Vietnam sequences were filmed in Hunting Island State Park in South California. And then you get this sort of really weirdly, like sort of like a slice of the Vietnam War in like 17 minutes.
Yeah.
It's an impressive sequence.
Hits all the beats, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's cliched, I think, even though I was reading some like making of documentary, watching some making of documentaries, and you've got Tom Hanks and Robert Zemeckis saying, "Oh well, we're trying to not do a cliched version of the war." And there's a direct quote from Hanks where he says, "We never wanted to do the tabloid pastiche of history. If we're going to invest in the idea of being in Vietnam, we had to do Vietnam right." But then you have like Fortunate Son as you come down,
it's all of the tropes,
the Hueys, all the tropes are in there. You got every man's got a nickname. You've got there's Dallas, he was from Phoenix, and there's Tex, and I don't know where Tex was from. It's sort of, you get all it's great dialogue, it's funny, but it's a very cliched, and I think this possibly is a film that's responsible for Fortunate Son being so ubiquitous for the war, perhaps.
It does. Does it feature in any others? Is it in Apocalypse Now?
I can't remember.
No, I can't either. There's an episode all on its own that tracing back the link of Fortunate Son to the Vietnam War in war movies.
Yeah, gosh.
But yeah, I totally agree. I think what it does is it comes off the back of that big glut of 80s war movies, Vietnam War movies. And despite what Tom says, it does kind of, you could, if you're being generous, you could say it hits the beats, or if you're not being in a generous mood, you could say it hits all the tropes of that conflict. You've got guys going through rice paddies, you've got airstrikes, you have napalm, you've got the classic music of the period. It crams in like 5 songs into that one little section, doesn't it?
17 minutes, like all the leaves are brown and things like that. But
it does it so well. It does it, and it fits within that sphere of the film. I think the tone of it fits within the rest of the historical elements they try and bring in throughout the rest of the movie too. Because
it does.
That's what one of the hooks of that movie is. He finds himself in all sorts of positions. And the dialogue, as you said, is really great. So, you've got the bit where he talks about all the different types of rain,
big fat
the point
rain.
where the rain that comes up from below and stuff.
Yeah, it's great. And you get all the visual representations of it. And then you just get some great dialogue where he's going through all his friends' names, like in the platoon. And then Lieutenant Dan tells him to be quiet and he starts whispering. I always found that really funny. Like he's the voiceover, like, why is he whispering? It's like great little sequence. But the ambush scene where Gump goes on to win the Medal of Honor for saving all the chaps from the napalm strike, that's a really well shot little ambush sequence.
Is, yeah.
Like it's far, far better than it has to be. And you've got unseen VC shooting them from the tree line, and they're all getting blown to buggery. And there's a really, really brutal, visceral explosion that kills the M60 gunners.
Yes,
and that's really that's amazing.
So interesting to see how they actually did that with the visual effects.
We found a making of
behind the scenes,
and they used pulled the men away with ropes without the explosion, then overlaid an explosion on top, and just the way that CG was used in that movie it's seamless now. It holds up so well.
It does. It ages well, doesn't it? I mean, I was fascinated to find out that the helicopters in that opening establishing shot where they pan over the camp was done by visually stitching in the fall that they actually had that flew past. They got all the shots of it and they stitched it in. But then at the same time, the F4s that dropped the napalm were CG, early CG. But it looks
so good. It's that whole thing of 90s CG holding up better than perhaps CG now because it's used so sparingly and there's more time put into it perhaps. But no, I think for me it's one of the strongest war sequences in a non-war film because it's so good.
Oh, I agree.
Yes, it's a bit cliched.
I mean,
and it crams so much in.
How many people suggested Forrest Gump? We had about six
6 or
7
7
people.
Yeah, it's for me. It's one of the best. So Matt, do you want to go through Atonement because it was one of your big picks?
Well, that's the one that jumped out at me first and foremost when I was thinking about the concept. And I just think that sequence of them reaching the beach and then that tracking shot that just follows them steady cam through all of those little nuanced pieces of set dressing and just
It's
the mise
layered
en
so
scène
well.
is
Yeah,
incredible in that sequence.
the
It's
layering
probably
is
maybe a little too much. I guess you could accuse it of. But when you
perhaps,
compare it
yeah.
to something like 58 Dunkirk or 2017 Dunkirk, I think it's up there. It's definitely
Oh,
up there
massively.
with the original 58 Dunkirk. And
Yeah,
it, it I think Nolan's Dunkirk pales a little bit in that the beach is just
it
too empty. It
knocks.
goes
No,
too
yeah,
far the other
yeah.
way.
It knocks to 2017's Dunkirk into a cocked hat because
Yeah.
I think how can you watch this sequence from Atonement? I know it's a film set within the 30s and the 40s. It's a historical film,
Yeah.
but for this to do it in the way that it did, again, it didn't even
Yeah.
have to do half of this, but
You're over halfway into the film at this point. You're not expecting it.
No, it comes out of nowhere, and you see James McAvoy and his two comrades walking through the French countryside, and you've got Daniel Mays berating the fact that how they're fighting and everything else, and then they smell the sea and they go through that sort of, I think it's like reeds or something, and they come up at the Bray Dunes, and it's just it's such it's a smack of the senses. It really is like sensory overload. It almost does what the Gump sequence does. It does it in, obviously the Gump sequence is nearly 20 minutes of screen time, and it overloads you with all these tropes and cliches. But then this does it in 5 minutes with BEF on the beach at Dunkirk, and not only do you see the men and everything else, but Dunkirk itself is smashed, and you've got it was Grimsby Ice Factory that was used for the bombed out sequences in Dunkirk.
The beach was a red car, so it was all on the northeast coast. And the attention to detail with it is really lovely. You've got Vickers guns set up, you've got a Bofors. There's even like a 25mm Hotchkiss anti-tank gun at one point. You've got a London lugger, which is, they apparently had to break it in. Well, I think they built it for the film. It was 4 parts. They had to winch it in, set it up.
The Lindy London Thames barge.
Yeah. You got that lovely sequence of the lads singing a hymn on the bandstand.
And that bit reminds me of 1917's the Wayfaring Wanderer song. I can't remember the exact song.
I know.
Reminds me of that.
Definitely. I think they cram so much into that sequence, and it works because you're there with them, and your senses are being bombarded by all the stuff that's going on, and the way that it's choreographed. Little things are triggering. There's a guy having a brawl with someone. There's someone that's drunk. Someone's vomiting out of a door. French officers shooting his horses, which is grim. There's lads knocking out radiators on trucks to deny them the enemy. There's lads trying to wade out into the sea. It just crams in so much into that.
It does.
There's even a guy hanging off the Ferris wheel. I don't know whether that was based on anything, but it's just like the level of detail, and that's in like the far, far, far background of the shot.
It's a proper bats you around the head, but it does it in such a good way. And it does, 1,000 extras used. All the uniforms were sourced from a place in Poland, and then they were weathered by the production crew. There's a quote here I got from the screenwriter Christopher Hamilton. He said, "In screen time, it's not going to be vast, but what you've got to suggest in the narrative of the whole movie is a world war. And the only way you can do that is to be very specific to this time, these men, this military disaster." So they really leaned into Dunkirk as being, because the movie's set in the early war period. So Dunkirk itself is a very important time for the British people back home. And then you see how it affects the characters afterwards, how it affects the narrative of the actual Atonement story as well. But to do it in the grand scale that it did, it's just amazing for me.
It's a surprise. It's a visual surprise. It's why whenever we talk about Dunkirk now, we have to talk about that film.
Yes, I think we do.
And that stands up to the testament of, well, he could have just done like a little shot of them wading in the sea.
Yeah, he could have. Yeah, he could have gone them getting off of some random pier somewhere, and it could have been the mole or whatever. But the fact you do that, and it's obviously to show it's obviously to show how it affects the character, because he's longing to get home and he's in this mad world of conflict.
And spoilers, he actually dies of septicemia there. But I think also it's worth mentioning the sequences of Bryony's character, or Bryony, the young girl, and she's a nurse in London, and we get to see the lads that have been brought back from Dunkirk, and there's a whole hospital sequence which is really quite good. It's not as immersive as the Dunkirk
grand,
sequence,
but it's good.
But it's very effective. But all in all, I think that is a cracking piece of war cinema in a non-war movie.
It really, really is, and I know there's this whole argument and it raged for decades, but it's, what's the better Dunkirk representation, the 58 one or the 2017 one? And I think it's got to be Atonement, and 58 have got to be up there on their own rung. And then, unfortunately, if any people disagree, they may work very well. Channel Incident. Then I think the 2004 BBC Dunkirk series, had a good crack at it. And then it's got to be 1917's Dunkirk, because I don't see Dunkirk as a true war film. Dunkirk is a piece of artistic cinema that is set in Dunkirk. For me, it's not as faithful as a representation as it could be. I know there's historians around that say, no, it's very good. Not all the beach was cluttered like that, blah, blah, blah. But I think when you're trying to do it on film, you need to ramp it up as much as you can. Yeah. And out of all of them, I think 58 does it the best. And I think Atonement does it the best for me. So it's up there.
It is. And then finally, we have Cold Mountain, which is a film I've never seen all the way through. I'll be honest. I'll say that now. Hold my hands up.
I think I watched it when I was very young.
But I rewatched the Battle of the Crater sequence, because we were going to be talking about it, and
of course,
and it did strike me. It was very effective, and I think it fits in very much so into that element of a filmmaker takes a shocking, visceral point and uses it to lay out the backdrop of the rest of the film.
Yeah, agreed. It's such a grand sequence for what it is, for maybe 6 minutes of screen time as well. It's the thing of our theme throughout this, when me and Matt were talking about, we were devising this episode, we were talking about how, for the screen time some of these sequences get, the amount of money, time, detail thrown into these sequences is very impressive for everything we've talked about, really. Considering most of the movies we're talking about don't need to go into so much detail as they do. It's very commendable, and it just shows how good of a film these films are, that they go out of their way to do this. But this one is set, and it recreates the Battle of the Craters, which was on July 30th, 1864, and it was American Civil War battle. And it's a set piece that kicks off the film, and you see the Confederacy laying their mines, and then you see the mine explode and the ensuing hand-to-hand battle. And it's carnage on screen, isn't it? It's so gritty and brutal.
It is. It's a really gritty movie, and the sequences of people getting stabbed and people being crushed into the mud, the explosion, and there's even a part where a guy's clothes are bent off him before you see him just disappear.
Yeah, that's so oh my gosh. Yeah, and you've got the men getting crushed between each other trying to get out of the crater, and there's a quote. It's not a direct quote, but there's a guy says like a turkey shoot, and that was one of the people who were actually there said
throwing rifles with bayonets fixed down into the mass like javelins.
Yeah, it's so like carnage. And then it's shot in Romania, that sequence actually. They built that battlefield from scratch, and the director was saying how they needed 2 craters, one to blow up and then one to actually work in. So that was interesting. There's some great behind the scenes sequences. And there's some good hand to hand at the end. Jude Law with a Lamat revolver saving his friend.
Yeah, of course.
That was quite good. And I thought, it's just another great little set piece, and it's so well done. And you just don't expect. You don't expect.
I was about to say that. Yeah, you don't expect it, do you?
No.
It's another example of a very indulgent.
Yeah, that's the
piece of cinema and filmmaking, and a large amount of budget, as you say. I would imagine going into it to create a little sequence that, granted, it provides that mental context not only for the characters but also for the viewer.
I think you're right. Yeah, and it's how you sell the movie in a way afterwards. It's like, if this start is going to be like this, imagine the whole thing. That's how I assume it was sold. But yeah, there was some great. That's another great sequence. All these clips we've talked about are easily findable on YouTube. That's where we watch most of them because they're all clips up these days.
Yes, people seem to like watching the battles from films with no context.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? It's useful for us for this episode.
It is, I suppose.
Yeah. So yet again, thanks for listening.
Do get involved over on the social media. We're probably most active on Twitter at Fighting on Film, but we do also have the Facebook page, and you can also check out our website, fightingonfilm.com.
Yes, please do, and we'll catch you next week. So thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.